Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. I was brainstorming potential November event ideas for grinding your games to run in PathOfExile 1, given today's news, in case you happen to miss it, that PathOfExile 2's early access slash open beta slash whatever they want to call it has been delayed until the 6th of December now. So this is going to mean 3.25, which was already looking like it was going to be one of the longest leagues ever. It is definitely going to cement that in place. Now, one thing grinding gear games have done in the past, when they've had to delay a new league start, they have run a number of different events that have been something that people who are still looking for more PoE 1 but want something different to the core game, they can jump over into one of these events, play something a little bit different for a little while, and the core game experience goes on in the background. So people who aren't interested, they can just ignore them. Some of the previous examples are both well-received events and poorly received events include Endless Heist, Atlas Invasion, Delirium Everywhere, but there's been plenty of others, including Endless Delve, which we're going to talk about a potential iteration of in this video. Anyways, the idea here is that not every player is going to be interested in these events, and that's fine. Those people can continue to play in Settlers League or even Standard League if that's their preference, and the game will be the same, except there'll just be fewer counterparties to trades they're interested in engaging with. However, I also wanted to keep in mind one very important thing. Grinding gear games probably don't want to run events that take a huge amount of programming resources to make happen, and so I wanted to make sure that everything from my limited knowledge of the way the game works under the hood would end up being less work than was put into the recent, quite popular Gauntlet event, the Runic Strife Gauntlet, that took place a few weeks ago. So I wanted to make sure that everything is quite similar to something grinding gear games have already done, with only minor changes rather than entire new systems that would need to be built for it. So, the first of these ideas is Endless Delve done differently. Endless Delve is an event that's been a player favorite. It's run 3 times. You're stuck in the Delve mine from level 1, you have unlimited sulfite, and the game mode also enforces solo self-found play only. You can't go to your hideout, you can't enter maps. This means there's a whole lot of limitations on the sorts of characters you can build. Characters in Endless Delve are much weaker than they are in the base game as a result. Now, I think there's a major problem though with Endless Delve, but each time that it's been run, the same builds have been overpowered, and that's because one of the starter items that they give you is completely busted in the context of Endless Delve. Alongside bad gear, one of the most powerful things you can do is corpse explode monsters and use that in conjunction with the ridiculous scaling on one of the ignite items. This was absolutely dominant to the point that the best juggernauts that you could play in previous incarnations of Endless Delve were not characters that were Juggernaut themed. Instead, they took on the power fantasy of the corpse exploding ignite builds. They basically played like an elementalist. They had a tree like an elementalist. The difference was they just specced into the Juggernaut ascendancy. The same was true for every other ascendancy. This was just the best way to play. There was basically no build diversity at the top end. There was plenty at the bottom end because plenty of people disregarded those builds. But for everyone that was watching this event being played out on Twitch, all of the top people, everyone that was below a certain depth, they were all playing the same Corpse Explosion Ignite build, just on a different character ascendancy each time. My solution here is to remove the starter uniques, but this is going to cause a real problem here, and that's because in Endless Delve, your character starts out too weak to progress. I think here the solution's pretty simple though. Instead of the game just giving you a few extra passive points every now and again to mimic the ones that you would earn through playing through the storyline of the game, instead, give all of those points at the start. So you end up as a level 1 character with 24 passive points to spend. This gives you enough power to get over the ridiculous high difficulty spike at the start of Endless Delve, and then you just don't get those points later on. So you still end up with the same power, but instead of it coming as borrowed power from items, instead you get borrowed power through early access to your passive points, and you don't have the problems that's caused by one of those unique items being completely broken at endgame in the narrow context of Endless Delve. You may still see players doing Corpse Explosion Ignite shenanigans, but there's one other thing that I want to change here. Endless Delve has what I term a hidden pillar. So a pillar is a principle of game design. Endless Delve's hidden pillar is that players have access to very, very bad items. And I wanted to ask a little question. Does Endless Delve actually need this hidden pillar? Would it be interesting if you could have a much more powerful character in Endless Delve than you've been able to make in the past? My idea here was that the weakest part of Endless Delve is the crafting that's available to players. What if players had unlimited access to the Recombinator from level 1? This would be something that would make Endless Delve feel monstrously different to the base game, but also very different to the times that it's run before. I also don't think it would take a huge amount of programming to make it work. There'd be a bunch of things that would need to be tested to make sure that having the Recombinator in the Delve Mines is something that's safe, or alternately having a portal to Kingsmarch where all you can get is the Recombinator, make sure that that's safe. But all in all, I think it's something that would be a pretty safe thing to do and could make things really interesting in Endless Delve, make everything feel different, make the builds that people use feel very different as well. The second thing that I think is worth considering if Endless Delve gets this sort of overhaul is this would also be the perfect opportunity to test some potential new chase items that grinding your games could in the future add into Delve, but aren't needing to commit to doing. They don't need to commit the way they would if they added them into the base game for a league. Instead, they can just be tested out here. And if they are interesting and they end up being something that are player favorites and that don't break game balance, then they can potentially be added into the base game in the future as well. I wanted to quickly present 3 ideas for items that could be tested in this environment. All of these are powerful. All of them are more powerful than the things they'd be replacing in current game, and as a result they do potentially contribute power creep, but I think they'd be quite interesting as well, and they might be reasons to incentivize people to come back to the Delve Mines. Of course, they might also be brokenly OP, and the best way to find that out is by testing them in an event like Endless Delve with Recombinators. The first of these is a Sanctified Resonator. This would essentially be a 5-socket resonator, but one of them is pre-socketed with a Sanctified Fossil. This would look like a Prime Resonator for using it, just with a more impressive looking artwork, and it would function the same way, but it would also, as well as the 4 fossils that are placed into it, it would also apply the effects of a Sanctified Fossil. What happens if you add a Sanctified Fossil in? That's up to Grinding Gear Games to decide whether you're not allowed to do that, or whether you get twice the benefit of a Sanctified Fossil. The second thing is a Sublime Resonator. This is intended to be chase, where the Sanctified Resonator is something that's just better than Prime Resonators, but not super chase. This is intended to be something that's really precious, really rare, and really expensive. This would be something that you would expect to be trading at the same sort of rate as a Veiled Orb in a trade league, so definitely something special and impressive, a real reward for going deep in the Delve Mines. And also for doing things you don't currently do in the Delve Mines, like exploring those fractured walls. Now this would function like a Prime Resonator, but with the additional text, always has the maximum number of modifiers, so this would normally be 6, but in some weird cases it would not be, and biases against rare modifiers are ignored. Now this is designed to make it so that you can get some really weird combinations of mods much more easily on items. Whether this is good or not, it's going to come down to the particular use cases players come up with for it. I think this is the most risky of the 3 items I'm presenting here, but that would make it probably the most interesting if it ends up being safe. Third is the Foresight Fossil, and this would be somewhat like the old Fractured Fossil, where it applies the fossil effect and then afterwards it applies an ultra rare currency effect to the item. The old version of the Fractured Fossil mirrored the item after scrambling it with whatever other mods were done with the fossil itself. The Foresight Fossil would replace the mirror effect with a Hinokora's Lock effect. So you would get the benefits of a Hinokora's Lock Foresight on the post-scrambling item. I think this is something that would be better off as a fossil than a special resonator, and it would be something that would definitely be sought after, but the use cases for it might be complex, and I don't know that it's something everyone's going to want to use, but it could definitely have some uses. Probably more important though than the items themselves is the idea of using these events as an alpha testing ground for potentially risky, potentially really interesting crafting things that may or may not be suited to going into the core game. Anyways, so that's my ideas for a refresh on Endless Delve, something that makes it a little bit different and that allows for safe testing of a couple of items that could make Delve more exciting if they were added, and of course, if they end up being problematic, there's none of them that even exist in Standard, much less into Settlers League. The second idea that I've got is for a mini patch followed by a 10-day fresh start league. After that 10 days, that would then dump into Settlers. So there is definitely not time for 3.26 before PoE 2. I know a few people were hoping that would be the case. I've said to anyone that's asked me, I do not expect 3.26 this year. But sometimes small changes can make a big difference to the way that things get played and just can open up a whole bunch of new farming options, especially new scarabs. Patch 3.24.2 last league introduced only 7 new scarabs, but a number of them have been instrumental to empowering new farming strategies. The Scarab of Wisps in particular, but also the Scarab of Radiant Storms. Abyss Scarab of Profound Depth doesn't quite get there, but at least it feels close. All of these have shaken up the game quite a bit when they've been added. And of course, players love a fresh start economy, or at least a section of the player base does, the rest can ignore it. So my suggestion here is to add 10 new rare or mythic rare scarabs that do pretty wild things, kind of like was done in 3.24.2, but on a slightly bigger scale with 10 scarabs instead of 7. Also, add a little bit of extra new content, but about 10 to 20% of what we would get in a league. So, a single new tier 17 map, and a single drop anywhere unique map that is not intended to be very difficult for experienced players. So essentially, there is a new boss for experienced players in the tier 17 map, but there is also a new boss that is aimed at people who might find Ulnatol or Chayula to be the toughest bosses they can beat at the moment. They find that there is something new for them to target in this new drop anywhere unique map. Now the idea here is that this patch would go live at the normal league start time, so it would be a Saturday morning for me, but if you're in the United States and similar time zones, it would be a Friday afternoon. Then there'd be a 10-day league event that would run. Players could join that if they wanted to. It'd be parented to the Settlers League. When it expires, they can migrate their entire progress across to Settlers, just like they could if they joined a private league instead. But I would also try something a little bit new as well here, because there's a good opportunity to test out a few things to see if they'd be good to have in the core game, but that might be a little bit of a risk. And the suggestion I've got here is that just for the first weekend, so just for this short period of time, the new scarabs, the new tier 17 map, and the new unique map, and the new boss that's associated with that new unique map, these are only available in the 10-day event. They don't exist in the base game. After that first weekend, they go core. So people who ignore this event and choose to play in Settlers instead, they'll be able to experience it, but on about a 60-hour delay. This is something I think PathOfExile should try out that Last Epoch has been doing recently. New bosses that are added to the core game in Last Epoch are not available in Last Epoch's equivalent of Standard until they've been beaten in the new League event. Once they've been beaten at their intended difficulty level, then and only then are they ported over into the permanent game, and then they can just be trivialized by characters that have got accumulated gear from a long period of time. The intention here is that this mini patch and 10-day fresh start would not be 3.26 and a new league start. But face it, we're not getting that until probably about the start of February, at least my expectations. And it is, however, something for the interim. After all, not every PathOfExile 1 player is going to like PathOfExile 2. Fundamentally, they're going to be different games. Some people will like one and not the other. That's perfectly fine. And part of the idea of keeping PathOfExile 1 and PathOfExile 2 teams somewhat separate is that Grinding Gear Games can continue to put out things for PoE 1, even if they hold them off until they don't conflict with PoE 2 releases, they can continue to put things out for PoE 1. I think this would be a good accommodation to the people who aren't interested in PoE 2 at all. The third idea I've got is taking something that wasn't done well the first time, Delirium Everywhere, and giving it a major polish pass. Now, Delirium Everywhere was an event Grinding Gear Games ran back in Calandra League. It was a failure. This really went down badly. I don't think there was anything inherently wrong with the event, or maybe there were a couple of things wrong with it, but the main thing was a mismatch of expectations and what the event actually delivered. There is definitely a market in PathOfExile's player base for the game done harder. That you can see by having a look at the popularity of the recent Gauntlet event that had over 60,000 unique accounts sign up for it. However, Gauntlet tells you it is going to try and completely break you. That's the reason it's popular. It says it's going to try and break you, it then delivers on that promise. Delirium Everywhere sounded like it was going to be a loot explosion league at first. It's like, oh, Delirium, that adds a little bit of danger and a lot of loot to maps. Well, when you went in and played it, you found that it was completely the opposite. It was adding all the danger, but not adding the loot. Delirium Everywhere felt like it was loot-starved, and just was really poorly received because of this mismatch between what it promised and what it delivered. So, my suggestion here is to remove the difficulty spikes that were present in Delirium Everywhere and make it so that it actually is what people expect. It is something where you go in there, it's harder than the base game, and there's also more loot than in the base game. Now, this might need to be a voided event, as it's going to drop a very, very large amount of items once players get rolling, although it is worth saying that the Affliction League wasn't voided, and so it's probably okay if this gets parented to Standard. It is definitely not okay for this suggestion to get parented into Settlers, as the best thing players who are looking to increase their wealth in the Settlers League can do then becomes to play the Delirium Everywhere event, stockpile as much loot as possible, and take it to Settlers. I don't think that is a healthy environment in any of these temporary leagues. You want it to be something where players play the event if and only if it's going to be fun, not because it's the best way to progress outside the event. All of that aside, the simple suggestion is this. Each zone has players are X% delirious, X% increased item quantity, and X% more item rarity for items that are dropped in the zone. This number X, though, is not random. X is the area level. So if you're going through the axe, you might have an area like the beacon. Players are 50% delirious, which does make monsters quite a bit harder. 50% increased item quantity, 50% more item rarity. But if you're then going and fighting in the Uber Cortex, you're going to be 85% delirious, there's going to be 85% increased item quantity, and 85% more item rarity. In short, the further you progress through the game, the more lucrative it gets, the harder it gets. However, for this event to be successful, the oppressive grey mist associated with Delirium has to go. It has to be toned down. If Groningen Games aren't willing to invest the time necessary to do that, then this event shouldn't run. Also, there's a bunch of things that would need to be turned off. So Delirium Orb, Simulacrum Splinters, related divination cards, all these things would need to be drop disabled for this event to run. Also, a number of other things would need to be decided on, like how rare a cluster jewel is meant to be, and Atlas passives associated with Delirium would probably need to be turned off. So there'd be a little bit of work necessary to make this happen, but I do think it could be quite an interesting event if Groningen Games decide that it's something people might be interested in. The fourth idea, though, is probably the one I'm most excited about, and that is to look at some obscure tech Groningen Games tested about 18 months ago. So they tested some events that were rather ambitious and weird in March of 2023. These events were very poorly received, but I think the underlying tech behind them was really impressive. It's just that they decided to dial up the group play element of them to 11, when dialing it up to 6 would have been more in line with what players wanted. So essentially, the old version of these events, back in March 2023, you could not progress at all when you were playing solo in most of them. However, underpinning this was a tech to create something akin to private leagues that allowed you to play in an event where you could group up and group self-bound with other players, but only a small number of other players. It was a genuine halfway house between solo self-bound and the entire openness of a trade league. In short, there's pretty much everything that players who like private leagues, like myself, like about private leagues, but it was done in a different way, and it was also, most importantly, done without the costs associated with running private leagues. So my idea here is to reuse that tech, but to use it without dialing up the group play elements to 11, and to keep the core basis of the game intact, but to use this tech in a bunch of different events. So one idea that I've got is for Groningen Games to run events that capture some of the feel of the player-run event BPL, which I played in earlier this league. BPL is always a lot of fun, and basically players organize into teams. For BPL, that's done by the actual event itself, but it does take a bit of outside the game organization in order to do this. Then once you've got your team together, you can try to complete some checklist of goals. Now, there's a number of things the game can track, like has anyone defeated Uber Atzuri yet? Has anyone defeated Venarius in the Cortex yet? A whole bunch of these things are tracked, and a lot of them actually result in server announcements. Now, these tracking flags that are used, these could be used to determine whether your group has completed a meta set of objectives between you. For example, one challenge might be for your group of 20 players or less to defeat all 4 Voidstone bosses within 1 week. Now, this is something that experienced players will probably be able to do themselves, but that for less experienced players, this would require stepping up and achieving things that they haven't achieved before. Or if you want something that's not brutally hard, but that is a big step up from doing those 4 Voidstone bosses, you could ask players to defeat all 3 enriched Uber Labyrinth bosses. But you don't need to do all 3 of them yourself. Just between the group of 20 of you, you've got some people that are farming the enriched Uber Lab tokens, and you've got players who are going and attempting them as they come in. Or alternately, if you want something a little bit harder again, you could go for all 7 of the Uber Pinnacle bosses. Of course, some of the best players in PathOfExile can definitely do all 7 Uber Pinnacles in 1 week anyway, but this is not really necessarily targeted at them. The aspect that's targeted at them is when we start talking about the time trial aspects that are involved in this tech. For people that are interested in PathOfExile's more serious racing scene though, there's plenty of room for this same tech to be used for time trial style races. How long, for instance, does it take for your group of 10 to slay Lycia in the Sanctum? Can you do it faster than any other group of 10 players that can come together during the period of this event? What about a race to defeating Nashta, the heist boss? What about commonly race 2 bosses like doing the first 2 Void Stones, but you have the additional advantage of having 10 players across your group, rather than just having 6, like you might have at League Start, 6 plus a trader, or just having 1 as you do in SSF. There's a whole lot of unexplored possibilities for this tech. I'd really like to see this March 2023 tech that undoubtedly Grinding Games still have all of the code for, brought back and used again, but used in a less meme event than some of those March 2023 races were. One final point that I think is really important here is that the prize structures for an event like this, if there are prizes, will determine who the target audience for the race events will be. If it's designed around rewarding the first X number of players that achieve a particular goal, that's going to result in an event that's tailor-made for elite PathOfExile players. On the flip side, if you want something that is more open, you can look at some of the things that were done in Gauntlet, where everyone that achieves a certain goal either receives a certain reward or gets put into a draw for that reward. That was done quite a few things in Gauntlet. For instance, everyone that completed the campaign got a mystery box, and everyone that reached level 90 got put into a draw for a major physical prize. This approach is better for mass appeal for the event if you want people to play the event. It also tends to make it less exciting for spectators, and so that's a bit of a balance. But I think all in all, it's better to err on the side of rewarding playing the event rather than watching the event. Watching the event is something some people will do because they can't play at that time, or because the event doesn't sing to them, but they expect there'll be some exciting moments in it. You can also split the difference a little bit. Anyways, just in summary, these are the ideas that I had. Firstly, endless delve with recombinators. I think this has a lot of potential to be something that's different, and also to provide an opportunity for Grinding Games to test new risky design ideas that could be interesting in Delve in the future, but that may not be safe to add. Secondly, a mini patch and a fresh start that only goes for 10 days and then dumps into Settlers League be something that would give that League Start feeling, but on a much smaller scale, especially if the mini patch has some new content in it that's not pushing the boundaries of what's possible, but that does have a few exciting things. Thirdly, Delirium Everywhere was a cool idea that wasn't executed very well in my opinion. It could be done better. And fourthly, the group found events are something that could be revisited. Ultimately, I'd be happy with anything from this list, and there's also undoubtedly a whole bunch of other ideas. The thing I really don't want to see is November being a month where there's basically nothing going on in PoE 1 land at all, and it's just more of Settlers League. A lot of people who aren't yet sick of Settlers League probably will be pretty soon, and that's always the consequence of a delay, even if that delay ends up being needed. I'm going to leave it there. May foreseeing fossils protect you from the most interesting and unwelcome results that you might otherwise have gotten from your Varlorbs.